Well, good morning, everybody. Phil likes to ask me about midweek. How's your sermon? You got it printed yet? I texted back and said, no, but I'm having a good time wrestling with God. He wrote back and said, wrestling's all fun and games till somebody gets their hip knocked out of joint. Linda says, Tim, how's your sermon? I just kind of grunted. On Friday, a guy called and said, hey, you got time to talk? I said, sure. He goes, what do you do? I said, just working on my sermon. So, rewrote it a number of times. Of course, John comes in this morning, his Sunday school class is on perspective, and it's like, yeah, it's a pretty good title for a sermon, too. So, let's get into it here today and see how this unfolds. Last week's message, we were talking about Jesus encountering a woman at Canaan in the city of Tyre. He had gone there, according to Mark, to spend some time alone. But people found out he was there. This woman heard that he was there, so she pursues him and asks him to cast a demon out of her daughter. Last week we looked at that conversation. It's an odd conversation that takes place. The disciples are telling Jesus to send her away. And again, today's message is perspective. Let's understand what's happening here. Jesus is with his disciples. He leaves Gennesaret. I didn't put it on the map here today, but around this area. Travels to Tyre, 35 miles. He wants to be alone or in a house trying to keep to themselves, and obviously people are finding out they're there. This woman finds out and she comes to ask him a question. The disciples understand that they want to be alone, so they tell him to send her away. He doesn't, and he starts to engage a conversation with her. And one of the things he says is, I've only come for the house of Israel. Again, if I were one of the disciples, I would say, well, all the more reason to send her away. Because we learn she's not an Israelite, she's from Canaan. So, if you put yourselves in the place of one of the disciples, this whole thing generates a bunch of questions. In this conversation, all of a sudden, Jesus proclaims, "O woman, great is your faith. Go your way, your daughter's fine." And I put in the notes, if I was there as one of the disciples, I'd have a lot of questions. And then this morning I wrote down, I'm just reading the text and I have a lot of questions. Why is Jesus engaging in a conversation with her in the first place? And then all of a sudden he proclaims how great her faith is. Now, as a disciple, one who's following the rabbi, who wants to learn and understand, I want to know, what did Jesus see? What did he discern? What did he detect? What was it about this woman that he just all of a sudden says, "Oh woman, great is your faith"? Think about that in our studies. Has Jesus ever said that to one of his disciples? No, they've been wrestling with growing in their faith. Jesus has never said that about any of them. That's not a downer, just understand. This is a shock to them. Here's a woman who's not an Israelite. She's from Canaan. First, Jesus ignores her. Then he begins to engage in a conversation with her. They're confused because he said, I'm only here for the house of Israel. Then how come you're talking to her? And then all of a sudden he proclaims how great her faith is. I wasn't with them there. I'm with them here in the text, and I'm still want to know, what did Jesus see? What did he pick up on that led to this proclamation? In this context, the disciples are bystanders. They're just observers of what's going on. But understand, as students of the rabbi, there's always something to learn. I remember as a young man going to church with some family members to a church that I had only visited on occasion, and the pastor starts to preach, and the husband says to his wife, "This message is about you." In other words, there's nothing he's going to say that has any application to me. And often we do that. Somebody starts, it's like, well, that has nothing to do with me at all. As students of the rabbi, as you and I as Christians, as we study the scriptures, we need to be in a posture of, God, is there something here you're trying to tell me? You know, Jesus knows that sooner or later he's leaving the earth and these disciples are going to be left behind to carry on the labor. So what are some things that they need to learn? First of all, that Jesus goes and that we as believers go where the Spirit leads us. That the house of Israel, God's house, is bigger than just the 12 tribes. Jesus calls the house of God a center of prayer for all the nations. As we looked before, God is the one who changes Abram's name, father, to Abraham, father of many nations. Man tends to look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. We know that in another context, but understand this one. The disciples are looking at this woman from Canaan and saying, send her away. Jesus says, there's something in her. There's a faith in her. I'm going to draw it out. And then I'm going to proclaim that it's there. Jesus will leave the 99 and go search for that one who's lost. Isn't it interesting that he travels 35 miles to Tyre, and all we read about is an encounter with one woman? Other people live there. Lots of people live there. But he deals with one. We need to learn to trust the leading of the Spirit. That he knows things that we may not be aware of immediately. And that we need to learn to go and do exactly what the Spirit tells us to do. All things that they can learn out of this encounter. Page 2 of the notes, if you're trying to follow me there, Matthew 15, verse 29. Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on a mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, mute, maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, and the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now Matthew doesn't give us a whole lot of information here. Mark adds to it. In Mark's account of Mark chapter 7, it says, again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region to Decapolis, to the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus has gone from Gennesaret, 35 miles to Tyre, 15 miles north to Sidon, and then he leaves Sidon and travels down this way. It's on their map there, I have on the notes. He travels from the north, skirts around the Sea of Galilee, and enters into the Decapolis. Approximately 120 miles. Again, for you and I, no big deal. You get in the car, 2 hours, you're there. They're not in a car. They're on foot. This is another one of those places where we have to have perspective. Matthew goes from one verse where Jesus is in Tyre, the next verse he's sitting on a hill. But in between those two sentences, they have walked 120 miles at a minimum. Not on flat ground. There's mountains in between Sidon and Decapolis. The Sea of Galilee is predominantly surrounded by hillsides and mountains. And then there's mountain ranges that run parallel up here. It's 120 miles minimum that they're walking. They're young guys, so they can probably make some pretty good distance, but still, you're not going over 20, 30 miles a day. And that's if you're walking with intention to get somewhere. Me, it would take me a month. I'm just going to sit down here for a little while. Yeah, I know. I get the other one done, I'll be in good shape. No problem. Just understand that between those two sentences, you're talking 6 days minimal. Which means they stopped somewhere probably during the night. They slept somewhere, whether it was outside, whether it was somebody's house, don't know. They don't tell us any of that information. But it also makes me wonder, what did they talk about? Again, just from the events that took place in Tyre, I've got a lot of questions for Jesus. They asked him to explain to them the parables. At one point in time, they asked Jesus to teach them how to pray. If I were one of his disciples at that moment in time, I'd want to understand what's going on here. Why is it when we wanted to be alone, you engaged this woman in conversation? Why was the first thing you told her that you only came from the house of Israel and that you kept engaging in conversation? She's a woman of Canaan. Why did you give her her petition? I don't understand. And then you proclaim she's got faith. Would you explain this to me? I could occupy those 6 days just with my questions alone. But we don't have any of that recorded. We don't know what has transpired, but they end up in the Decapolis. Now let's understand again what the Decapolis is. The name is 10 cities, Decapolis, 10 cities, believed to be predominantly occupied by descendants of the 7 nations that were driven out of the land of Canaan. So the people living in this arena were the people that were living here that God had the Israelites drive out of this land so the Israelites could occupy it. In other words, they're entering into enemy territory. Remember, even today, the people that live in this area don't like Israel. They're fighting over this region all the time. Jesus has just wandered into an arena of people who are seen as people to be stayed away from. Remember, God told them when they settled in the land, stay away from these people, because they'll lead you into worshiping their God. Stay away from them. Jesus just walked in there and sat down on a hill. Now remember something else. Again, perspective. Let's really begin to understand this story. Jesus had been there before. Matthew chapter 8. They got in the boat and went to the other side. And at the other side, they encountered a man in the graveyard who was filled with demons. Jesus cast the demons out. They went into the pigs, ran down into the sea, and died. The man's in his right mind. The people of the town hear about it, and they come out and they say to Jesus, leave. That's what just happened before. Jesus has just now walked back into this arena where he wasn't wanted before. But what's the text tell us? He sits down on the hill. Somehow people find out he's there. We're not given that piece of information either. And they start bringing to him all the sick. From the time that Jesus was there healing the demoniac to now, these people's perspective has begun to change. When you realize over time that the guy that could help your circumstance, you told to leave, there's probably a strong desire that someday he might come back. And today was that day. Notice also that when he went to Tyre, he went into a house and wanted to be left alone. But in this case, he doesn't go into a house to hide himself. He goes and sits down on a hill. Why? Because it's an open space and lots of people can get there. You can have a crowd. You can't have a crowd in a house. So they start bringing to him all of the sick, and he heals them. They marvel at what he does, and they glorify the God of Israel. Now again, perspective. These people worship lots of gods. A man from Israel has wandered into their land and is dealing with their sick people, and they begin to worship the God of Israel. That's a good thing, but it doesn't mean that they've left their other gods behind. Lots of people like what God can do, especially when we tell them about going to heaven. And they'll add God to the mix of their lives. But it doesn't mean that they deal with all their other gods. They've just added God for the heaven thing. Again, as a disciple, I would begin to wonder, Jesus, why are we here? I would think the last time we were here, they told us to leave. Why are we going back? If somebody tells me they don't want me around, I'm great at honoring that request. I'm not going to keep imposing myself on somebody who doesn't want me there. This whole area, from here all the way around and all of this is all Israel. There's lots of places Jesus could be. But he intentionally, the scriptures say he skirts around the Sea of Galilee. I love that word, always have. He bypasses all the places he could be and intentionally goes here. Which again, as a disciple, there's something I need to learn. That even though they rejected me once, it doesn't mean that I, the love of God, writes them off. And one of the things we begin to learn is, in the time between Jesus' first visitation and his second, these people's attitude about him has begun to change. Because notice, they're no longer concerned about their pigs. All they know is this man can heal the sick. As disciples, we must learn not to get offended at people's rejection. Yeah, I'll say that again. As Christians, we must learn not to get offended at people's rejection. Because it takes a while sometimes for the truth to get through. Trust me, if anybody knows what having a thick head is all about, I got one. We must also realize that God is doing the same thing among these people as he's done among the nation of Israel. But from God's perspective, it's not just about healing them physically. Physical healing is a sign pointing us to the reality of who Jesus is. The one who has come to restore us to the Father. All signs and miracles, while they have great benefit in the physical realm, are also pointing us to something that is spiritual. A healing of a relationship between us and God. The response to this crowd, in Matthew's account, they glorify the God of Israel. In Mark's account, they're astonished beyond measure and say he's done all things well. My guess is they probably wonder, why did this guy come back? If we told him to leave once, why now is he here again? And why is he willing to do these things? It'd be very easy for Jesus, one, as a Jew, two, in following the commands of God written in the Old Testament, to have nothing to do with these people. But remember, Jesus has come to institute the new in place of the old. And he's doing among them what God wants him to do. Now, there's another part of this story that I want to talk about today, page 3 of the notes. It's actually found in Mark's gospel. There's some intriguing things in his gospel that I want to explore. Some of the perspectives that I'm going to communicate are my ideas. But let's consider this. Page 3 of the notes, Mark 7, verse 32. Now, where Matthew says that the multitudes brought a whole bunch of sick people, in Mark's account, he talks about one. He says this, "Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude, put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue." Now that part of the story ought to be enough just to get us to stop and say, what? Just those few sentences generate lots of questions in my mind. First of all, Jesus takes the man and he walks him away from the crowd. Why? Then he sticks his fingers in his ears. Well, yeah, they used to do that to people in high school all the time, called wet willies. Spit on their fingers, stick it in your ear. Used to do it all the time. Do it to me, they were going to get slugged. He spits and touches the man's tongue. Now again, we just left Tyre, a woman of Canaan, where Jesus does none of that. He simply says to the woman, "Go your way, your daughter's fine." We've looked at other situations with the Roman centurion's servant. He says, "Go your way, he's fine." Jesus could have looked at this man and said, "You're okay." But he sticks his fingers in his ears, he spits and touches the man's tongue. Why? Again, I'm a disciple. I'm trying to figure things out. Is this how the healing process goes? By the way, anybody here want healed? I'll be more than happy to stick my fingers in your ears and spit. If you ever read the Gospels, you'll find that Jesus did a lot of different things in healing people. Sometimes he touched them. Sometimes all he did was have to speak. We're going to get to another story later where he spits in a guy's face. You look and say, why does he do these things? Remember, Jesus said what we interpret to be some offensive things to the woman at Tyre. "Sorry, lady, I only came for the house of Israel." To be interpreted, "I'm sorry, you're Canaanite, I have nothing to do with you." You could get offended at that. But she doesn't. Because she's after something. She wants to make a connection with this man. Now again, understand what's happening here. If I stick my fingers in your ears and then spit and touch your tongue, where are you and I in proximity? Face to face. Real close. Notice the man is deaf and he has a speech problem, but his eyes work fine. He sees and knows everything that Jesus is doing. Notice he doesn't seem to get offended. Okay, if this is process, this process. I told Linda if I knew then what I know now about getting a leg repaired, I may have had second thoughts. I think this is a test. Remember where Jesus is. He's among people that don't like Israel because they're descendants of those that were driven out of their land. How many feuds still go on today because of property? How is this man going to react to what Jesus does? Are you trying to offend me? Are we getting anywhere with this? What's the people who are watching from a distance think? Again, as a disciple watching this, I want to know what's going on here. Because again, as a disciple, I know Jesus doesn't have to do this. And according to Matthew's account, he healed all these people. How did he do that? Did he just speak to them? Did he touch them? What did he do? I believe Jesus is looking for the response. Are you going to get offended and walk away? But there's more to this story. Verse 34. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed. And he said to him, the Greek word, I'm not going to try and say it. That is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened and the impediment of his tongue was loosed and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should not tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Now again, it'd be easy to just read through this and go past it, but I can't do that. He looked up to heaven and sighed. Why did Jesus sigh? Why do people sigh? Well, the pastor's long-winded. When we sigh, it's telling us that there's something inside that's unsettled. We're disturbed. Sometimes it's frustration. Happens for a number of reasons, but it's an indication that there's something that bothers us. Let me jump ahead to Mark 8 for a second, and then we'll come back to this because it's another place that's recorded. Mark chapter 8, just a little halfway down on page 3. Verse 11. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? It's interesting that Mark records for us twice in a very short period of time about Jesus sighing. The second one we understand. He's bothered that the Pharisees and Sadducees have no interest in the truth. He's frustrated at their unbelief. So if I begin to analyze what's happening with this man and with the crowd, I have to wonder, when Jesus is doing these things to the man and he's face to face, folks, imagine this for a second. Imagine you and I, individually, standing before the face of Jesus, with him wanting to develop an actual relationship with us. And he's looking at our inner being to see if we're interested in having a relationship with him. And let's imagine for a moment that when he looks at the Spirit within us and sees no response toward him, what do you do? Again, folks, understand the context of the stories. He was up here. He said some offensive things to a woman at Tyre, but she stayed. And he says to her, "O woman, great is your faith." There's a connection between this woman and Jesus. We explored that last week. Now he comes down here. People are bringing to him all their sick. He's touching them. They marvel at what he's doing. They glorify the God of Israel. But folks, that doesn't mean that they have an interest in a relationship with him. Now they have progressed. The last time he was there, they asked him to leave. This time they're not telling him to leave. They're bringing their sick to him, and he's touching their sick. But that does not constitute a faith relationship. And I believe what Mark is telling us is here is Jesus getting ready to deal with this man face to face, intimacy. And he's looking for the heart response. And there isn't any. He heals the man. But I believe that Jesus is saddened by the fact that there's no interest in him. Many people are willing to get healed and then go their way. Many people want Jesus to solve their problem, but they're not interested in God coming in and, quote, messing with my life. I still remember when I was a senior in high school, I got a phone call from the Navy trying to get me to enlist. They said, "Hey, we got great opportunities." I said, "You know what? I'm kind of enjoying my life right now." The guy said, "I have no response for that." I think Jesus sighs because he's looking for faith and he's not seeing it. I don't want to fit that category. I don't want to be a user of Jesus for my issues. I want to walk with Jesus in a relationship. And they're different. But again, let's not write this off. Jesus does not condemn these people, but he also doesn't proclaim great is their faith. But they're different than who they had been. But before he leaves, Jesus isn't finished. Page 4 of the notes, if you're following me on that, Matthew 15, verse 32. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, "I have compassion on the multitude because they've now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way." His disciples said, "Where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a multitude?" Jesus said, "How many loaves do you have?" Now again, it makes me wonder, they had just come off of the feeding of the 5,000. Have the disciples forgotten that? Or does it have something to do with where they are? They're among people that God had said, don't hang out with those people. Is that influencing their thought? Why should we bother feeding them? We're not supposed to be here to begin with. But again, as a disciple, we need to learn that we need to go where the Spirit leads us to go and do what the Spirit tells us to do. And be willing to bear with people even in their unbelief. And to minister the love of God to people that aren't currently believers. Doesn't mean that they never will be. So Jesus feeds the multitude, sends them away, and then he gets in a boat and leaves. Doesn't mean he's finished. Doesn't mean he's written them off. Just more time has to pass. An aspect I jumped over, I'll get right back to it, and then we'll finish this out. The other thing that Mark tells us is that Jesus tells them, quit telling people that I'm healing you. Stop spreading the news. They don't. They keep doing it. But again, it makes me wonder why. If Jesus is willing to heal anybody who comes and asks him, why does he tell him to stop? I think the reason is because they're not getting the message of the sign. They see healing for healing. That's it. They're missing the point that the healing has a bigger purpose. And the man who's healing them has a greater message, which is that once God drove you out, but I'm here to draw you back. That you who were once not part of the household of God can now be restored. They're missing that whole message because they're only interested in the healing. It doesn't mean that they never will hear. Because remember, when Jesus leaves, he sends the 12 out and others to go into all the nations. And we know, especially through the writings of Paul's ministry, that multitudes of Gentiles come into the kingdom. But we also find in his account that no one is asking Jesus to stay. Again, they didn't always, it's not always recorded in the scriptures, but when Jesus went into Samaria and met the woman at the well, and then she went back to town and told people, hey, the Messiah is here, and they come out, they ask Jesus, stay with us for a while. And he does. These people don't ask Jesus to stay. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it tells us, I believe, that they're simply missing the point. So why did Jesus go there? He knew all of this. Because sometimes our ministry is simply to start preparing the soil. Again, it's why it's significant to me that the first time he was there, they told him to leave. This time they're not telling him to leave, they're bringing their sick. So after more time passes, maybe their attitude towards him will be different when he comes again. Maybe now they'll actually be interested in the message. Apparently some will be. So sometimes what you and I are called to do is simply to prepare the soil. Start laying the groundwork. Something that I rejoice in, but from a human standpoint, often causes me pain. I've been at this business full time now for 28 years. And it always cracks me up that somebody that sat under my teaching many years ago will say, oh man, I was sitting in church and they preached on this and it was like, wow, and they were talking to me and I was like, I talked about that for the last 10 years. And the human part of me was to say, how come you didn't get it then? But then I look at it and say, but God, it's not about me, and I just rejoice in the fact that they got it. You realize that sometimes you're simply there to help prepare the soil. Not even plant the seed, just prepare the soil. Which I think is what's happening here in this scenario with Jesus. Sometimes we plant the seed, sometimes we water the seed, and sometimes we get to be the one who reaps the harvest. But it's not about who gets to do what. It's simply just being obedient to what the Spirit tells us to do. And that's okay. Does sometimes it hurt? Well, yeah, just like Jesus sighed. Sometimes God leads us to talk to somebody, we talk to them, and you know what you get is glaze. But also understand, Jesus doesn't try to force this. Jesus doesn't stand there and start teaching the people. What would be the point if they're not prepared to listen? If their focal point is, we just want these people made well, it's not the time to preach a sermon. My son used to tell me, sometimes, Dad, you just need to learn when to shut up. Because the other thing is, these people are probably confused too. Why is this guy here? We know they don't like us. We know their God told them to drive us from the land that they're now occupying. Why is this guy here? Why is he healing our people? Yes, we're grateful that he is, but why? Why is he here? There's a lot of things that get in the pathway of us and understanding what God is doing. So Jesus does what he's been told to do, and he gets in a boat and he leaves. That's okay. Sometimes what you and I are commissioned to do is to go and do whatever God says to do, and then leave. You don't have to make something happen. You just walk in obedience. Because the Spirit of God is moving in the realm that you and I can't see. And we just have to trust him in that. Everybody okay? So I'm not going to push it farther than that. You stand with me this morning. Father, just help us to see what you're telling us. To gain a perspective, Lord God, for our own lives. But Lord, especially that Jesus didn't withhold from people. That he gave, he poured it out. But he didn't try to make people believe. He trusted you and your working and your plans. Lord, as students of his, children of yours, help us to learn that, Lord, too. To be obedient to what you show us to do, to go where you lead us to go, but to trust you with whatever the outcome is. And to have the right attitude of your character in dealing with people around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.